Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the International Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Valuation of the Locational Merit and Benefits of Diversification of Onshore Wind Power. We are grateful to our speakers, Dr. Reinhard Madlener and Tim Herfer, for today's timely discussion. First, a little bit about the International Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest association specializing in the field of energy economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services you can find on our website at www.iaee.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our speakers. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for the panelists, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of the webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our speakers, Dr. Reinhard Madlener and Tim Herfer. Reinhard, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's my pleasure to moderate this webinar today. And we actually have 2 presentations for you, which are closely and complementary, closely developed. Tim Herfer is a member of my group, and I would like to share the slides with you now. Because on that slide, I also have a brief overview of our institute and who we are. I'm actually Vice President of the Swiss Association for Energy Economics. I've been a president for a number of years and a member of the IE for about 30 years. So I'm getting more and more senior, as it seems. I wished Leo Klee would have been with us today. He's too busy with a consulting company. So I tried to present a study that he did as his master's thesis, and which we are about to publish and make available in the form of 2 working papers. A topic of my presentation is the optimal configuration and diversification of wind turbines using a hybrid approach to improve the penetration of wind power. Now that's a snapshot of my group here in Aachen, University of Technology in Germany, probably the leading one. Aaron Praktikno, who is also engaged in the IE, is a junior professor in my institute. And we have about a dozen PhD candidates, a few postdocs, and support staff. I'm also senior editor of Energy Policy, if some of you might know. That's just a side information that could be useful. Now that's how I look today, more like I just showed you before. And this is a group picture that we took a few years ago under the theme prosumer. Now that's the overview. I'll start with a brief motivation why we did this part of the study, and I walk you through the conceptual framework, the model, the data used, the analysis we did and the results we got, and then I will conclude with a brief summary. Wind power, as probably all of the audience knows, plays a crucial role in many countries in the world also for decarbonizing the electricity supply system. Increasing market penetration of wind power leads to a decline in market value, which is sometimes called self-cannibalization. So the success of wind power reduces the wholesale electricity price, which we call the merit order effect, and eventually also wind power operators will suffer from the lower prices. Subsidies are usually necessary to lead to profitability. And these subsidy needs are closely linked to the market-based profitability changing over time. Now, there are 2 possible solutions that we put our focus on to mitigate the market value drop that we see. First, system-friendly turbines. That's a technical story and analysis. And second, geographical diversification. Tim Herfer, by the way, will also focus on this diversification and the system integration costs, but with a very different approach. The system optimal level is ambiguous. Why? Because when advanced turbines have higher upfront costs, then this is a disadvantage. And on the other hand, diversified sites have potentially less favorable wind conditions. So we need to find out how much impact from which factor, and how are the trade-offs, and how can we optimize the solution. Now, our hybrid approach tries to help, at least in a threefold manner, to improve the market value or to reduce the decline, to reduce the total system costs, and to reduce the overall subsidy needs. So this requires quite a holistic modeling approach, and tries to integrate several influencing factors. The research questions are listed here. Can the hybrid approach really help to mitigate the value drop of wind power? Can the hybrid approach close the profitability gap between the market value and the levelized cost of electricity? And thirdly, can the hybrid approach reduce the total system costs? We did the analysis for the case of Germany over a time horizon from 2018 to 2030. Now, what's the advantageousness of the hybrid approach? Can this be expected to depend on both the country's wind and power system characteristic? Yes. So it's not just the wind conditions, it's the entire power system that needs to be modeled and understood. There is a bunch of related literature. The literature has been growing over the last years, and I hope that some in the audience see their papers included. I did not have enough space to list them all, but in our article, we made a detailed review of the current state of the art, identifying the gaps, and also our original contribution to the literature. Well, just two aspects. Many of the studies that we reviewed analyzed the competitiveness of the variable renewable energies and conventional technologies by following just a cost-based or levelized cost of electricity approach. Others combined the application of two strategies, system-friendly turbines, spatial diversification for penetration rates, but not as high as penetration rates that we cover, because we look up to rates of 65%. And at least for Germany, such a study in our view was missing so far. Now here is a map of Germany, or three of them, showing what we did. First map shows you the total system costs market value development with high penetration rates of up to 65%. That's the goal of the German government for 2030 for the business as usual, i.e. if we try to extrapolate recent trends into the future and see what happens. And then we want to compare that with our hybrid strategy, where we take grid-friendly technology into account and also geographic diversification. You see that we split up the country in 38 regions. It is not two classification regions, 38 of them, and then only did an analysis in more detail on 4 regions that looked most promising in terms of geographical diversification. And what we do is we compare our outcome from the hybrid approach versus the business as usual approach or scenario that we also determined. So we look at the difference BAU minus DIV for diversification, and also we checked some sensitivities and also analysis in more isolation to check what additional benefit is really from diversification and how much do we see benefit from system-friendly turbine configurations. Now, this is an overview about the model architecture. In the middle somewhere you see EMA, the electricity market model developed by Leon Hirth. And for most of you, Leon will be a well-known figure. And this model is open source, so anybody could ask for permission to use the model and also modify it. This model was used to come up with the market values, but also the total system costs. And as inputs, as you can see, we had to deal with the configuration specific costs with the region and configuration specific energy model. We used hourly wholesale electricity prices, and we determined variance reduction potentials, the region and configuration specific LCOE, and the region and configuration specific market values to come up with the diversification area selection I showed you on the previous slide, and the turbine configuration selection, which was more of a technical exercise that I will come in a minute. Here you see a first slide on the right-hand side, the power curves of 4 different specific power turbines that allowed us to decide which turbine technology we want to use in our analysis. You can see that for some turbines, this curve is steeper, which means they can have a higher capacity factor for the same wind speed. And on the left-hand side, you see again the map of Germany with the 38 regions based on the NUTS 2 wind speed classification. Now, in terms of OPEX, CAPEX, capital expenditures, operating expenditures, we also had to look into this to do the cost analysis. And you can see here for different hub heights and also for different specific power in watts per square meter that the cost increases as the turbine height or the specific power increases. You can combine the two and then you get the solid blue line compared to the dashed lines. Now, in terms of the CAPEX, the turbine costs depend a lot on the specific power and the hub height, so that's a major influencing factor. But there are also site costs like foundation, infrastructure costs, other cost components that need to be appropriately taken into account. Now, then we looked at the diversification area selection, and this is just a schematic diagram that shows you roughly how we did it. Don't have much time to go into the details, but all these details are documented in the working paper available next week. So we chose the areas based not just on the variance reduction of the wind power output, but also on the levelized cost of electricity. And because of geographic limitations of EMA, we only investigated 4 exemplary promising diversification regions in the end. Now, the turbine configuration optimization was based on the discounted difference between the unit cost per kilowatt hour and the expected electricity value, following also the work by May published in 2017. We look at the turbines to be chosen with the smallest gap between the market value and the levelized cost of electricity, kind of the most profitable ones. And regarding the current and future wind fleets, we had to look into the benefits of our approach by assessing and comparing it with the business as usual turbines. So this is also in terms of the wind power plants and the turbines installed today, but also into the future up to 2030. And the assumption was to allocate the turbines according to the awarded bids of the 9 auction rounds that we had in the recent past. So the idea is here representing where the new turbines in the current support scheme under current market conditions are planned to be built, to be quite realistic where the next turbines will be installed in the next years to come. And then we move on to the EMA model, the European Electricity Market Model, which we adapted in several ways. For example, we included the 4 diversification regions that I already showed you on the map. We also implemented offshore wind technologies, and we represent also technologies for the future and the current wind fleet, which was not in EMA per se. There is an assumption of a linear increase of penetration from 28 to 65%. So the linearity is an assumption that has an impact on the results, but we found this quite convenient and simple enough to use this assumption. And then we also had some more data like the CO2 price that you can see here from 24 euros per ton up to 35 euros in 2030. Nuclear phase out as it has been decided in Germany until 2022. And the linear coal phase out assumption until 2038, which is again the law that says either by 2038 or maybe earlier 2035, coal should be phased out in Germany. Nuclear and coal phase out has tremendous implications on the power supply and the market in Germany, so this all has to be appropriately taken into account. Then we also assumed some technical potential based on the literature for advanced wind turbines in Germany, and this comes up to 620 gigawatts overall. For the cost assumptions, you see some sources at the bottom, but I'll skip that for now. And of course, you can also have the PowerPoint slides later from us made available. In terms of selection results, the wind fleet variance reduction potential is shown in this graph. And the dark red colors show you the high potential there is, which is primarily in the south, where the wind conditions are not as favorable as in the central north. And in the central north, you also have correlations with the aggregate fleet, which is highest there. And that's why this variance reduction for the output is lower. Important to mention is also the trade-off. There is a trade-off between the higher variance reduction that goes along with higher LCOE, which you can also see from the left graph shown here. And on the right-hand graph, you see again these 4 selected areas, which were the most promising ones in terms of diversification, but also with having an eye on the LCOE. Now, some results on the turbine optimization shown here for high wind speed locations, as we see them in Schleswig-Holstein, which is the windiest NUTS 2 region in all of Germany. You can see that for the LCOE, we find that the LCOE increases with higher hub heights, but decreases with lower specific power, whereas the market value decreases with higher hub heights and increases with lower specific power. If I have the time at the end, I can come back to this to give you some more explanation, but often it has to do with the relative impact of using more hours of low wind speeds as well. And the benefit of high hubs is not always a benefit because it comes with costs, as I showed you with the cost curve. Now, this is in comparison the situation for moderate and low wind speed locations, for example, in Rhineland-Palatinate, where we see, in contrast to the previous result, that LCOE decreases with higher hub heights, and the other results are more or less the same as I had before, decreases with lower specific costs, whereas the market value increases with higher hub heights and also increases with lower specific power. And you see the minimum also shown in this slide. So that is then a hub height of 160 meters and the specific power of the turbine of 175 watts per square meter. And just to flip back again, the minimum here was for hub heights of 90 meters, and again, a specific power of 175 watts per square meter. Now next, for the conclusions from these optimal turbine configurations, we can say that lower specific power, which is system friendliness, is always better. Low hub heights are optimal for high wind speed locations, and high hub heights are better for moderate and low wind speed locations. Next, I'll show you for the 4 selected areas, the optimal configurations. It's a bit hard to see, especially the numbers are small printed, but by and large, we find the optimum for relatively low specific power and hub heights of about 150 to 165 meters. And here you see the application of the hybrid approach, how much this really gives you in terms of the profitability gap. This can be most easily seen. There is a significant difference of about 0.75 billion euros per annum, which is equivalent to 5% reduction in the overall subsidy needs compared to the business as usual. And yeah, we also find a reduction. So the hybrid approach, our approach really seems to be better or slightly better in most of these indicators that we looked at. Next, the market value. Using the hybrid approach, we get higher market values, as you can see from this slide, compared to the business as usual additions. You can see on the x-axis that we have the increase in the variable renewables. This also includes offshore wind and solar power. We do our analysis and only for the onshore wind, and we study this up to 65% renewables penetration. And you can see the differences, 1 to 2 euros per megawatt hour at the 30% level of today versus 2 to 7 euros per megawatt hour at the 65% level of penetration. And one reason for this result is the increasing onshore wind farm penetration, which rises over the model horizon from 18% to 38%. In terms of profitability gaps for the hybrid approach, you can see the results here for the regions that we covered versus the business as usual. And some observations include that the profitability gap increases. And if we have, the reason is the decrease in the market value. we find that the two regions, DEA and DEB2, are markedly lower in terms of the profitability gap. That reason is the generation costs are lower because we have higher wind speeds in those two regions versus the other two regions covered, but also there's a higher use of the system-friendly turbines in those two regions. And the diversification areas have high market values. Again, that was already evident from the previous slide. Next, the profitability gaps. For DEA, that's one region, and various penetration rates plus learning rates. So we also look at different learning rates. You can see at the bottom from 0 to 60%. And at some point there is a learning rate level where the profitability gap becomes actually wider or higher versus the other situation where we are able to reduce the profitability gap. So learning plays a big role, but also the penetration of the renewables over time. And finally, in terms of the total system costs, you can see here the cost savings that we calculated, and they are quite substantial and they are rising rapidly from, say, 24% shown here in 2018 to 30, 35, and 40%. And then we have a peak, as you can see, in terms of the percentage. There is a peak, and the reason is the energy potential of the diversification areas with the lowest levelized cost of electricity becomes exhausted. That's why the benefit doesn't continue like that. And over the model period, the total systems costs of the hybrid approach model are definitely lower than for the business as usual. And the cost reductions increase steeply up to 40% and then decline after that in percentage. But in absolute terms, it slightly increases further all the way to 65%. Now, in terms of savings, in terms of conventional and renewable generation costs, we also did some calculations, as you can see here. For renewables, the blue line; for conventional, the gray line, or is it gray? And we find here that there is a lower need for flexible generation in the hybrid approach, and we have even lower generation costs. We have lower levelized cost of electricity in the hybrid approach and lower overall wind generation costs. To compare some sensitivity analysis we did between the business as usual and business as usual with the hybrid approach combined, we can see that this doesn't lead to much improvement as we would expect. But here we try to signal out the diversification effect per se, and we find that this is really not the big story. It's more the system-friendly turbines. To summarize, hybrid approach was shown to result in higher average market values, smaller overall profitability gaps, and lower system costs, which is quite an impressive result. Only a small share of the system benefits, however, can be attributed to diversification. The most system savings are actually due to the system-friendly turbines. We call it SFT only, as you can also see from the graph below. And neither the business as usual development nor the hybrid approach result in mainstream merchant profitability, which means subsidies are likely to be necessary for the foreseeable future. Diversification is not the main issue, but system-friendly turbines should definitely be taken into consideration. To conclude, for the selected diversification areas, if equipped with system-friendly turbines, the market value drop is less severe. You can read the numbers yourself. The profitability gap, i.e. the subsidy need, in diversification areas increases more slowly, and the total system costs decrease by about 0.85 billion euros per year, or 1.5% of the total system costs at a 65% renewables penetration. A large share of the benefits is attributed to system-friendly turbines and a low share to geographical diversification. The profitability measured by market value minus levelized cost of electricity can be increased by system-friendly turbines at both the current and the future penetration rates. Some diversified locations can become increasingly profitable at higher penetration rates. And last but not least, I point out to the follow-up paper that is currently under preparation, where we also want to look at the system and subsidy optimal expansion areas, and a value-based support scheme that could actually steer investment towards lower overall subsidy needs and system costs. Well, that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I will look now into the question and answer section. And as I said, this paper will be available sometime next week. So I see 3 questions there. How do you treat exports and curtailment? And I'm sure some of these questions I cannot answer you right away. David, I'm sorry. I will have to check to be sure. But this was not a specific element. So I take it, either we did it as it is done in EMA. We did not change anything to that, but I need to check how exactly it is done in EMA. The second question, the obvious question this presentation raises is transmission costs. Yes, we also looked at those. I don't have the figure at hand, but they can be found in the paper. As we looked at all the different costs to balance off this volatility in supply, the cost savings in terms of transmission costs were actually accounted for. And hang on, the third question, does the modeling cover the transmission and distribution of electricity? What software was used in the sensitivity analysis? Question I cannot answer right away. For the sensitivity analysis, we more or less made some changes, as I explained, with this isolation of the diversification to see whether and how the results change. But otherwise, software-wise, I need to really consult Leo to make sure I give you the proper answer. And the system-friendly turbines, yeah, that's a question. How can you, or how did you define the system-friendly turbines? We have a long definition in the paper. If I can grab it, I might just find the page. And otherwise, again, first pages of the paper are very detailed about this. Maybe it takes too long, but I can also save it and look it up during Tim's presentation. Maybe that saves us some time. And I have another question from Martin Linden from Next Kraftwerke. You think the hybrid approach might also reduce the imbalance costs of the German wind portfolio? I think it would. I agree so. And I think our study also showed this. It's system beneficial, and so the imbalance costs should certainly be reduced. We did other studies, by the way, in our group to look at how to improve on the balance costs, and Tim will also cover that in his presentation. Well, I think for now I see no other questions that I have not started to talk about. As I said, those I was not able to answer right away. I will try to do so in the aftermath. And with that, I would like to hand over to Tim to start his presentation, to give him a fair amount of the time. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And then with this, I would like to start my presentation. It's about a paper that was accepted for the Energy Journal and will be published soon. It's about the locational inefficiency of renewable energy feed-in into the electricity grid, and it covers a spatial regression analysis. I would like to start with a short background. This article also analyzes the German electricity market and some specialities. So here you see a map of Germany and how the electricity system looked like in the past. So in the past, most of the electricity was generated by conventional power plants, and those were located close to the load. But then with the energy transition going on, more and more wind turbines and photovoltaic systems were installed. And with this, some challenges arose. So the first challenge is that we see an imbalance between electricity generation and electricity consumption. So in 2018, approximately 2/3 of the electricity was generated in northern and eastern Germany, whereas 2/3 of the electricity was consumed in South and West Germany. Another challenge is that renewables like wind turbines or photovoltaic systems generate electricity variably when the wind blows or the sun shines. And then these renewables are mostly connected to this distribution grid and feed the electricity into this grid, instead of compared to the conventional power plants who mainly feed the electricity into the transmission grid. And this meets a situation in Germany where the reinforcement of the electricity grid, and especially of the transmission grid, is lagging behind. So in 2018, only 15% of the planned transmission grid reinforcement was conducted. And the problem with this is that this leads to overstress of the electricity infrastructure. So in the short term, to resolve this overstress, the system operators curtail power plants. So in the first step, they curtail conventional power plants, but if this is not enough, they have to reduce the output of renewable power plants as well. And the system operators get a compensation for the restrained electricity, which the operators of the renewables, sorry. And the system operators can pass on these costs to the customers in the considered region. So on the left side, you can see the curtailment, the amount of curtailment in 2017. And as you can see, most of the electricity was curtailed in North and Eastern Germany. So with this, this brings me to the two research questions of this article. First, which drivers induce the occurrence of RES curtailment, so the reduction of the output of renewables? And what are the regional curtailment costs of different renewables? So as I mentioned, this study focuses on Germany. And within Germany, we selected 4 distribution system operators, which cover approximately 40% of the German area and are responsible for the majority of RES curtailment. And these distribution system operators have different characteristics, like they feature wind-dominated, PV-dominated, or low-load regions. And we analyzed 3 years from 2015 to 2017. And then to further refine our analysis, we divided the distribution system operator regions into smaller subregions. And we did that by, with a Voronoi tessellation. So in a Voronoi tessellation, polygons are created around seeds, and then the points, for example, the power plants, are allocated to the closest polygon. And as seeds, we use the high to medium voltage level transformer stations. So with this, we get 1,111 DSO subregions within these 4 DSO regions. We cover 3 years. So this yields a spatial panel data set of 3,333 observations. For our regression analysis, we use a 2-step Heckit sample selection model. The first step of this model is this so-called selection equation, and the second step is the output equation. The selection equation is a probit model which corrects bias from non-randomly selected samples. So here the dependent variable, so the RES curtailment costs, is a binary. So either a curtailment occurred in a year and in a DSO subregion or not. And all subregions, all 1,111 subregions are considered. And this selection equation analyzes the impact of renewables on the probability of occurrence of RES curtailment. And to connect the step 1 and step 2, we calculate the inverse Mills ratio and include it in the second step. to cover the bias from the non-randomly selected samples. The second step is a spatial econometric model, which captures cross-sectional dependence between neighboring regions. And in this equation, we only consider those subregions which experienced curtailment of renewables in the 3 consecutive years from 2015 to 2017. And in this linear regression, we included 2 different kinds of spatial models. The first is the so-called spatial lag of X model. So this model analyzes the impact of the explanatory variables on neighboring regions. And the common correlated effects model here is inserted in the error term and captures the cross-sectional dependence by cross-sectional averages across the subregions. And with this spatial econometric model, we analyze the impacts of renewables on RES curtailment costs. So for our regression analysis, we allocate all variables to the DSO subregions. Our dependent variable is the curtailment costs measured in euros. Then we have power plants like wind energy, PV system, bioenergy, hydro energy, and conventional power plants. But we only consider those power plants that are connected to the distribution grid. And we analyze 2 different models. In the first model, we use the installed capacity of these power plants to explain the curtailment costs. And in the second model, we use the generated electricity to explain the curtailment costs. Then further explanatory variables are the load of a DSO subregion, the average wind speed, and then 2 dummy variables. The first is the distribution system operator, who is responsible for the subregion, and then the year in which the curtailment costs or the curtailment occurred. So our dependent variable, the cost for curtailing renewable energy sources, is not publicly available. So we had to calculate this dependent variable ourselves. And we did this in 3 steps. The first step is to calculate the potential hourly output of renewables during the curtailment measure. So we used the data, the MERA2 data of NASA, which publish hourly wind speeds or solar irradiation, and use it to calculate the variable output of wind turbines or photovoltaic systems, for example. Then the second step is to compute the reduced power output of renewables stemming from the curtailment measure. So if an overstress occurs, the system operator can choose to reduce the output of renewables to 60, 30, or 0% of the nameplate capacity. So the potential output minus the reduction stage yields the reduced power output. And then finally, we calculate the RES curtailment costs in the subregions by multiplying the reduced power output with the remuneration tariff of the renewable, and then summing all the costs up for the respective DSO subregions. So here you can see the results. On the left side, you see the variables we introduced. The 5 first variables are the power plants, and explain the influence on the DSO subregions in which the power plants are located. And then with spatial lag, we highlight the impact of the power plants on neighboring regions. And finally, we also give the load as one variable. So, and then, we have the 2 models which I just introduced. One's the installed capacity in megawatt, and then the second model is which uses the generated electricity in gigawatt hours. And for both models, we have a selection equation and an output equation. So for the first model, the installed capacity, we can state that wind energy, photovoltaic system, and bioenergy increase the likelihood of occurrence of RES curtailment by 0.3% per megawatt. In contrast, more load reduces the likelihood of occurrence that renewable energy systems have to be curtailed. We see the same pattern in the second model. Here we see that an additional generated electricity of wind, PV, or biomass increases the likelihood that a renewable has to be curtailed. For example, wind energy increases the likelihood by 0.07% per gigawatt hour. And again, additional load reduces the likelihood of occurrence of RES curtailment. And then for the output equation, this measures how much the curtailment costs in the DSO subregion increases. And as you can see, only wind turbines have a positive significant effect on the costs. And we also highlight that the spatial lag, so the impacts on the neighboring regions is not significant, meaning that wind turbines only increase the costs in the respective DSO subregion. And here, an additional megawatt of installed capacity increases the curtailment costs in the DSO subregion by 0.7%. And for the generated electricity, also only wind turbines increase the costs for curtailing renewables. And here, an additional gigawatt hour of wind energy increases the cost by 0.02%. And to make this a little bit more feasible and understandable, we divided our subregions into 4 quartiles. And here in red, you can see the most affected subregions. So with the highest costs for curtailing renewables. And then we calculated how much an increase of 0.7% per megawatt or 0.02% per gigawatt hour would mean. And as a result, we calculate that an additional installed capacity of wind energy increases the curtailment costs in a DSO subregion by 28,300 euros a year. And this is approximately 2% of the installation costs of a average wind turbine. And furthermore, another megawatt hour of generated electricity induces costs of approximately 8.1 euros per megawatt hour. And this is approximately 9% of an average remuneration tariff for wind turbines. So this article, we investigated the impacts of implementing renewables into an inflexible energy system, and then analyzed the regional varying costs of curtailing renewables to stabilize the electricity infrastructure. And as a result, we first see that most distribution system operating subregions do not experience curtailment to a large extent. In fact, only 223 subregions experienced curtailment in the 3 years from 2015 to 2017. But then, especially in northern and eastern Germany, reducing the output of wind turbines induces high costs. So our recommendations from this analysis is to set regionally varying price signals for renewables, like grid use charges or grid installation charges. The other possibility would be to set incentives for flexibility options, such as battery storage or electrolyzers to produce hydrogen, or power to heat or power to gas applications. With this, I would like to finish the presentation, and I thank you for your attention. and then I'm gonna search for the next question.
We've got several questions.
Yes, I think the first one is from Julian.
Yes.
So the question is, one other thing, is it possible to include monthly dummies in the regression equation so that the adjusted R squared might increase? So this is possible, yes. Then you just have to calculate the monthly costs for curtailing the renewables. But in our case, we wanted to know the yearly costs of these of curtailing renewables. So you probably would rather include the amount of curtailed electricity in a month as an explanatory variable. But I'm not sure if that really would increase the adjusted R squared. Then the next question is, how do you separate the model error of the dependent variable from your findings? I'm not really sure what this means, to be honest. Yeah, maybe you could post the question again. Then I'm happy to answer this question. The next question would be, how is the compensation system for generators regarding wind curtailment in Germany? How is it calculated? Is there a minimum limit, hours, month, for curtailments in which the generators have no compensation? So yes, there is a law that says that the renewables get 100% of the curtailment costs it costs if or as long as the curtailment is, I think, less than 99% of the yearly output. But in general, the renewables get a complete remuneration for the curtailed electricity. So for the renewables, it doesn't really make a difference if they generate the electricity or not, because they get paid anyways. And yeah, this is what causes costs, because of course you have to pay for electricity that wasn't even produced to save the stability of the grid. Then the next one is, dear Tim, what is the cost share from the 4 DSOs compared to the overall German feed and management costs? That is a good question. I don't have the don't have the number in my mind now, but especially one DSO, which is located in northern Germany, Schleswig-Holstein Netz, regularly has the majority of all curtailment in Germany. So I'm not sure about the percentage, but it is definitely the majority of the costs that arise in Germany. It's a little bit difficult, though, to assess the costs, because the Federal Network Agency only publishes data on state level, whereas we calculated the curtailment costs for the distribution system operators. So I can only, if you want to write me an email, I could only send you what we have calculated for the DSOs, but there is no published data on that. Then the next question, I don't know if we have still time.
Yeah, we have still 10 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Can you estimate the parameters in this selection equation for different regions instead of for the whole country? What we could do is to separate the data set for the 4 distribution system operators we have included. we did not do that to have a larger data set and then more statistical relevance. But yes, you could definitely divide the data set and then look for developments for the 4 DSOs. What we did instead of splitting this equation is to use dummy variables. So these dummy variables for the distribution system operators then cover for differences in the specific regions in our analysis. The next question is, are you going to provide the slides of your presentations? I think we can do this. I guess we said that before.
Yeah, no problem. We do that.
And then the next question is curtailment pro rata or last in, first off? Again, I'm not quite sure what is meant. Mr. Madlena, do you know maybe?
Well, which ones are curtailed first? Is there a
there's a ranking, so to say?
Temporal ranking, yeah, so to speak.
Yeah, so the system operator is pretty much free to decide which renewable power plant he wants to reduce the output, and he has to decide on the region. So maybe he sees that one region the grid is overstressed quite a lot, so he first curtails the renewable power plants located there, and then within the all the technologies, the renewable energy technologies, he then is, there is a ranking, I think, but it's also based on, for example, costs and which renewable has the highest impact and causes the highest costs in these regions.
Yeah. Maybe we jump back for a moment. There was another question by Julian sent at 4:39 that we have not addressed yet, Tim. Do you see it?
39.
It has to do with photovoltaics.
That was for me, okay. It's not clear from the outside whether Germany has distributed rooftop PV. If so, is this included in the PV listing for the curtailment independent variable? So yes, Germany has a lot of rooftop PV, and we included both. So rooftop and bigger PV systems, and both are a part of the explanatory variable PV. Yeah.
And we have 2 more questions at the bottom, right?
Yes.
By Philip.
Yeah, Philip. I didn't really get why we need a selection equation approach. Would you care to explain again? Yes, okay. That's quite interesting because in the second equation, our output equation, we only regard those subregions which experienced curtailment of renewables in 2015 to 2017. So with this, we select a subsample of our whole subsample, which is not randomly selected. So there's a bias of selecting these subregions, and if we didn't do that, if we just use a spatial econometric model, our results would be way too high. So it would attribute too large influence of the explanatory variables to the costs of curtailment. So this selection equation considers this selection bias. And then the last question is, does the PV independent variable include rooftop distributed PV? I think that was the same question as asked earlier, if I'm not mistaken. And
that's Julian again, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, rooftop PV is included in the independent variable. Yes.
So we tried to answer all the questions on the list as good as we could. We can type in some answers that we first have to look up. I think or take it that is possible also after this webinar. And if there are no more questions, I would like to hand back to Dave Williams.
This is Rebecca Lilly for the International Association for Energy Economics. IAEE wishes to thank Drs. Reinhard Madlener and Tim Herfer for an outstanding webinar. This webinar and slides will be available on IAEE's website for future download. If you are not a member of IAEE, we encourage you to join by visiting www.iaee.org. We thank you for attending, and I now officially close this webinar.